live on the website, which just has a little lag. Hello to everyone watching from home on this slightly dreary Tuesday evening. It is a huge pleasure to be welcoming you virtually to the Lighthouse in Edinburgh. Imagine yourselves in the bookshop tonight. Tonight we have a host on our behalf, the wonderful Stef Lauer, who has a background in tourism, outdoor education and training, with a special interest in natural and cultural interpretation, heritage and the environment. She is fascinated by all things Anne Lister, and she runs Edinburgh's celebrated Anne Lister tours, which she will tell you about shortly. Here is Stef to be your host, along with our very brilliant guest of honor, the author Jill Liddington. So if you would all from home raise a glass or get a bit goofy and clap your hands, welcome to tonight's Lighthouse event. Over to you, Stef.
Woohoo, absolutely. Hello, good evening, everyone. I'm Stef, and I'm delighted to be here. I run Anne Lister walking tours in Edinburgh. I'm a walking guide and was delighted to be able to combine my passion for walking, heritage, and all things Anne Lister. 2020 has been a bit of a tough year, so I had a bit of musing time, and it was also that year when the diary pages of Anne Lister's diaries from the year 1828 were transcribed. And that was the year when she, together with her love interest at the time, Sibylla MacLean, gallivanted through the Scottish Highlands and Islands. So they spent a good couple of months traveling through Scotland, spending quite a bit of time in Edinburgh. And thanks to the diary transcriptions, we were able to kind of trace her footsteps, kind of walking in the footsteps of the places where she worshipped, where she ate, where she drank, where she partied, where she did some sightseeing. So to kind of put that into the fabric of Edinburgh, into the old town, into the new town, it was an absolute delight, real pleasure. We got a bit of support by Heritage Lottery funding, which made all of that possible and kept me in work for a while as well, which is really, really nice. So instead of kind of taking you out for a walk, which we might be able to do in the next installment, taking you out for a walk before another chat with Jill, I thought I'd share with you one of my favorite passages of the diary pages from May 1828. So this is Anne Lister gallivanting off to the highest point in Edinburgh, Arthur's Seat. From the palace, went along what is called the park and along the radical walk lately made under the Salisbury crags. Very fine view of the town. At the end, got over a gate and went to a little church. Here I left Miss Riddle to wait while I went up to the top of Arthur's Seat. I always love how she's parking her companions now and then. Then went around a little and got to the top in 10 minutes, as fast as I could. Wind very high, dared not stand, but sat a while on the topmost crag, admiring the fine view all around me. Well worth the trouble, amply repaid. No traveller should miss it. The city as on a map at my feet. The Firth of Forth very fine. Descended in 10 minutes, right down in a straight line, down the crag, never dreaming of it being so bad. Ladies should not attempt it, but go around. So this is what Anne made of Edinburgh. Hopefully you'll be able to join me at some point on a walking tour. So I've been extremely grateful to National Lottery and extremely grateful to Lighthouse Books to ask me along to host tonight with the amazing Jill Liddington. Very much so, you can't look at Anne Lister without coming across Jill and her decades-long research into all things Anne Lister. She's very much a researcher, historian, scholar, and very much helped resurrecting Anne into our modern day and reading about her and her exploits, especially in the 1830s. Her book, Female Fortune, wasn't just the inspiration for Sally Wainwright's Gentleman Jack, but it's also now in the latest edition from 2022. So without further ado, my real pleasure to hand over to Jill, phoning in from, I think, near Halifax. Is that right, Jill?
Absolutely, yeah, not far away. Thanks very much, Stef, and hello to everybody, even though I can't actually see you. Stef's talked about how Anne Lister visited Edinburgh in 1828 with well-connected Sibylla MacLean of Tobermory, which is near Mull, on Mull. And Anne Lister had met Sibylla MacLean through the Belcombes, who you know of, in York. And through Sibylla, Anne Lister was introduced to a new and aristocratic world, escorting Sibylla's niece, Vere Hobart, to Paris, and so meeting Vere's great aunt, elderly Lady Stuart, a key figure in Anne's social climbing world in the 1830s. Sibylla died about 1830, and Anne Lister then set up home in Hastings with Vere Hobart in 1831. But there were male suitors, in particular Captain Cameron, and in 1832, Vere married and became Lady Cameron. Anne Lister saw this as an absolute betrayal, and more of this in a moment. This takes us to the start of Gentleman Jack and the start of Female Fortune, which, as Stef noted, came out in 1998 and was the book that inspired Sally Wainwright to write Gentleman Jack, with now a new MUP edition. And I'm so pleased with the new cover. I think it's just wonderful. Thanks, MUP. But let's focus on Anne Lister herself and her diaries. I think most of us had watched last Sunday, Gentleman Jack Series 2, Episode 1. I don't think anybody will have missed it. And there are now over a dozen Anne Lister books. So what's important about Anne Lister and her diaries? Let's start with two of the most crucial points that set her apart from virtually everybody else. Firstly, Anne Lister was a world-beating diarist. She wrote her diary of 4 to 5 million words, 1/6 of it in code. It started as a schoolgirl diary in 1806 when she was age 15, and the first words are, "Eliza left us," Eliza being her first lover. And then by 1808, she'd evolved into a fairly impenetrable secret code. And this continued for the next 32 years. Anne Lister was an indefatigable diarist. She continued her daily diary with scarcely a gap till her death in Russia in 1840. Daily entries grew in length, especially in the 1830s. The code's tricky. All the letters run together, so you don't know where the gaps in the words are. But for me, and I think most other people who've tried transcribing, the handwritten sections are more difficult because Anne Lister abbreviated so much. So Mariana Lawton becomes M, Anne Walker becomes A, etc., etc. And there's a whole lot of local names, which unless you live in the West Riding, West Yorkshire as now, you're going to get very confused by. But I decided to pursue this because her diaries are so magnificent. But it wasn't until 2011, so 11 years ago, 171 years after her death, that the United Nations, and through it UNESCO, included the Anne Lister diaries, or recognised the Anne Lister diaries in the UK Memory of the World Register, along with, amongst others, Samuel Pepys. So at long last, recognition, global recognition, international recognition for Anne Lister's magnificent diaries. Second, as you know, Anne Lister was a lesbian. She had no interest, romantic or sexual, in men. She had some men that she was very fond of, her Uncle James, she was really quite loving towards, and had a lot of respect for him. And there were very useful men who she had time for and quite good relationships with. Her lawyer, Robert Parker, in Halifax, some of the coal agents or land agents who helped her on the estate. But that was the extent of it. The younger Anne Lister had a succession of affairs with other women. Outstanding was Mariana M in the diaries, who betrayed Anne Lister with a conventional heterosexual marriage. And then again, as we know, in Hastings in 1832, Anne Lister was deeply wounded by another woman's conventional marriage plans. Anne Lister retreated home to shabby Shibden, very despondent. But Anne Lister was action woman. She couldn't spend her time sitting around Shibden and having a mope, tempting though it was. She decided she had to redesign Shibden to make it smarter, and she had to find a life partner. And soon, very soon, matter of weeks or months, reacquaintance with Anne Walker, neighbouring heiress, set that in train. There was the betrothal in 1834, taking the sacrament together at a church in York later in 1834, very private ceremonies. And for Anne Lister, this symbolised marriage, though of course it was recognised neither by the state, nor by the church, nor indeed by civil society. Nevertheless, as you know from watching Gentleman Jack, Anne Walker moved into Shibden by early September 1834. Anne Lister would never, ever, ever deploy the fig leaf of heterosexual marriage. And in that, she was very, very unusual. And more of this lesbian marriage soon. And then thirdly, Anne Lister developed her Shibden estate. From 1826, when the death of her uncle, she inherited Shibden. He was a traditionalist. He scarcely developed the estate at all. And Anne Lister decided that's not good enough. She had to make it elegant. And she wanted to be elegant like the friends of Lady Stuart, aristocratic women she got to know now. And she got to work with a whole number of workmen. She if in doubt, delegate. And there was a lot of digging and barrowing and stone carting to make the terrace in front of Shibden. And it was very costly. And probably on the estate, Anne Lister's most singular success was to develop her own coal mines. Way up high, Walker Pit, bit small, bit isolated. Then a bit later, down below Shibden, Listerwick Pit, which eventually did become an economic success. So what you want to know is, did other women run their own coal mines? Yes, they did, but they were mainly widows who'd inherited them from their late husbands. I know of no other woman other than Anne Lister who was so entrepreneurially active and successful in coal mining as Anne Lister. I'm going to pause here a moment about Anne Lister's amazing achievements, because I know that unless I say something about how I got to know Anne Lister, somebody will ask me in the Q&A towards the end. So here's my story. I moved to Halifax in 1980 and found it a very traditional, very conservative, small little sea town. Deindustrialization had hit it, textiles had gone, engineering was going. Feminism hadn't arrived, though a few of us soon put pay to that. And it was definitely not a good town to be gay in. I knew a little bit about Anne Lister from 1984 onwards, when The Guardian ran a big feature called The 2 Million Word Enigma, adding at the end that Anne Lister may well have been a lesbian. I was then employed in the adult education department at Leeds University, so I was teaching a new opportunities for women course in Halifax, as it happens. And this was when 1989, when Helena Whitbread's book came out. And it was the first book to present the coded passages it transcribed. So it had real local impact. So I brought pages of this book into my classroom in Halifax to these adult women students. And they all, to a woman, exclaimed, "Oh, we'd no idea. Nobody told us," which was true. It had been hidden. I am a feminist historian, and I lived at that point, 1980s, about a mile from Shibden. So Anne Lister was sitting on my very doorstep. I'm fascinated. I decided to go into the archives. I should check, has The Guardian got it wrong? We used to call it the Growniad because it even got its own name wrong. So is it really 2 million words? And does anyone remember microfilm? Microfilm forwards and backwards and forwards and backwards. This was me with the microfilm reels and my little pocket calculator. And whatever I did, whichever way I did it, it came out at 4 million words, not 2 million, as the Guardian had suggested. So I retreated ashen-faced from the archives in Halifax and decided I needed a new research strategy, but what? I decided to start with the history of the diaries themselves after Anne Lister's death in 1840. And this is what I produced. And I don't know whether any of you have come across it. This is the first book that came out in 1994. And the most often quoted passage of anything I've ever written in my life was a description from around 1892 of how John Lister, who by then inherited Shibden Hall, tried to crack the Anne Lister Code late at night at Shibden, helped by a fellow antiquarian, Arthur Burrell, as around 1892. And it is a melodramatic story, and please read it in Presenting the Past. But the 1890s was not a good time to write about lesbian sexuality. As you probably know, the 1885 Act had made male homosexual activity more harshly criminalised. We all know about the Oscar Wilde trial. And it became more difficult because John Lister himself was probably a homosexual. So what it seems is, and I tell this story in Presenting the Past, the diaries went back behind their secret panels at Shibden, and a 40-year silence continued, right up till after 1933 and the death of John Lister, the last Lister to inherit Shibden Hall. Excuse me. By the early 1990s, I was completely hooked on Anne Lister. Helena Whitbread had worked on the early decades, so I decided to focus on the later years, mainly 1830s. Helena had focused on the code first, but I decided I really must read the diaries as Anne Lister wrote them, which is she starts in handwriting, then she goes effortlessly, almost mid-sentence into the code, then back into handwriting, then back into code. And that's what I did. And years of painstaking transcribing and editing followed. And the result was Female Fortune. Here's the book, but it had a slightly different cover back in 1998. And as you know from Gentleman Jack, it told the story of Anne Lister after 1832, after she returned home despondent. And the covering decided she needed to remodel Shibden to make it more in line with the country houses of her elite friends, many of whom were Scottish. And she needed to remodel herself. She would no longer just be a European traveller and high society flirt. She would become the respected and powerful inheritor of Shibden's ancient acres, and she would find a life partner. And as we know, reacquaintance with neighbouring heiress, wealthy Anne Walker of Crownest, followed. But before we move on to Gentleman Jack, let's go back to some of Anne Lister's other magnificent and amazing achievements. There were many and varied. You name it, she could do it, pretty much, apart from winning at backgammon. She was a Renaissance woman. So here's three. She was extremely physically fit. If you walk in Anne Lister's footsteps, say round the Shibden estate, you get exhausted pretty quickly. She was an experienced mountaineer when that was almost unknown for women. Her most impressive ascent was climbing Vig Merle, which you probably know is the highest peak in the French Pyrenees, which she climbed in 1838. I was so impressed, I decided I really must. If Anne Lister can do it in 1838, I can do it in 2003. And luckily, my brother-in-law is an experienced mountaineer, without whom going up was fine, but coming down, I was just every single step of the way. I was in awe of Anne Lister and her achievement, because we had to hurry over snow-covered glaciers before the sun melted the crevasses, and that could be just dangerous beyond dangerous. I was in awe of Anne every step of the way. Next, Anne Lister was intellectually very adventurous. You probably know that. She was very clever, and she read voraciously, not just what was in Shibden's impressive library, but also borrowed books from the Halifax Literary and Philosophical Society library, and became an inveterate book buyer when she could afford it. What does she read? Politics, yes. Geology, yes. Darwin, look out for Darwin. Engineering. And if she was planning to go somewhere, like, for example, Russia, which she did, she would read, and she read everything there was. I don't know whether anybody's come across Captain Cochrane and his pedestrian journey through Russia. Not pedestrian as in boring, but pedestrian he is, just walking. And it's a riveting read, and became Anne Lister's Bible in the late 1830s. And finally, she lived a lesbian life in Halifax in the 1830s. Now, how on earth was that possible? Well, it's crucial to remember Anne Lister was a member of the landed gentry, albeit minor landed gentry. She'd inherited Shibden Hall's ancient acres, so she could do almost what she liked. And Shibden Hall, as you know, if you've been there, and I hope if you haven't, you're going to go soon, was tucked away from prying eyes down in Halifax. It was over the top of the hill. And down in Halifax lived many of Anne Walker's prying relatives, their prying eyes. And the other thing I think that helped Anne Lister to live the life live a lesbian life in the 1830s was she did behave pretty discreetly in public. She dressed very discreetly. She dressed in a very female way. And one of the interesting things about the Vig Merle climb is she details handkerchief by handkerchief, muslin, bit of muslin, the clothes she was wearing, and they are all absolutely so female. And she was going just with 2 local male guides. Finally, let's get back to Gentleman Jack and Sally Wainwright, who'd grown up locally, not far from Halifax, and kept in touch with school friends. And she told one that she was interested in Anne Lister. And the school friend gave her a copy of Female Fortune, which had very recently come out. And Sally was immediately inspired, of course she was. And we met in 2001, and we worked together very enthusiastically, very energetically. But the time wasn't yet ripe. She was a jobbing scriptwriter then, you do bits on The Archers or Coronation Street. And we went our separate ways. Sally, with a considerable more chutzpah than me, writing Last Tango in Halifax and Happy Valley, amongst other very successful television drama scripts. But I knew she hadn't given up on Anne Lister, because DIDS, Desert Island Discs, 2014, they invited her on because she was by then, 2014, an award-winning scriptwriter. And she selected as the book to take with her to her desert island, along with the Bible and Shakespeare, Female Fortune. My heart missed a beat when I heard this on Radio 4, because it was every author's dream to have, it was my 3 seconds of fame. So thank you, Sally. Around 2016, so just a couple of years later, I started working with Sally again as historical advisor. But then I got caught up in my first women's history love, which was the Votes for Women centenary in 2018, and I couldn't let that go. So I had to say goodbye to Anne Lister and Gentleman Jack for a bit. So I had no idea of the tsunami that was coming. Then spring 2019, Gentleman Jack. First in the US and then in the UK, massive publicity, massive popularity. And I was delighted to have an on-screen credit saying that Female Fortune was the book that originally inspired the TV drama. And I just love the notion of the premieres. There were 3 premieres, film premieres for Gentleman Jack Series 1. New York, London, and Halifax. Yeah. And what followed was extraordinary. I'll just give you a little example. The museum staff that runs Shibden Hall Museum reported over 3-fold increase in visitor numbers. In July 2019, I gave a talk with Helena Whitbread. We were invited to give a talk in the Halifax bookshop. The event sold out in seconds, not minutes, but seconds, because it only held about 45 people. So they moved it to the town hall, and that sold out very, very quickly. So what else was there in Halifax? Well, it has to be the Halifax Minster. And before long, 250 lucky people from the UK, the US and Europe crammed into the Halifax Minster pews. Helena spoke, I spoke, and then a woman with a New York accent, I realised, in the Q&A at the end stood up and said, "This isn't a question, it's a comment." And I went, oh God. And it turned out to be a woman called Pat Esgate. And she said, "My comment is directed towards Helena and myself." And I quote, "You have actively changed people's lives. You have taken a major step for women, and I thank you." Helena and I were overwhelmed. The audience burst into spontaneous applause, and many had tears rolling down their faces. And Pat Esgate from New York went on to lead as lead organizer and Lister Birthday Week now. There's even a book now called The Gentleman Jack Effect, especially about the effect on the LGBT community, particularly women from the States. And there's a small number, admittedly, who've not only had their lives changed, but have actually moved house to come to live either in Halifax or near Halifax. And there's even a group called the Blister Sisters who are going to be walking up Vic Merle. So let's end by returning to Anne Lister herself and her magnificent diaries. 2011 UNESCO UK Memory of the World Register, but there's more. October 2020, so 18 months ago, I was giving a talk, yes, it was on Zoom, to the Portico Library in Manchester, and such was the enthusiasm for Anne Lister, everything Anne Lister, I got asked 21 questions, and one of them was about the chance of ever discovering Anne Walker's diary. And of course, I replied very cautiously. If only I'd known what had gone on in Halifax the day before. But Anne Lister researcher Diane Halford, sitting in Calderdale Archives, Halifax, which had just reopened after the COVID closures, was researching Anne Walker's legal difficulties after Anne Lister's death in 1840, and chanced upon an obscure file in the Rawson manuscript material. And the Rawsons, as you know, were cousins by marriage to the Walkers. It looked like a travel journal written by Anne Lister, but it was in Anne Walker's writing. And Diane's hunch that it was by Anne Walker was confirmed by an entry for the 19th of January, 1835, 5 years since I lost my poor brother. So, wow. She discovered a volume of Anne Walker's diary, and a few days later, the archivist at West Yorkshire Archives Service was formally able to authenticate it. A torrent of exuberant publicity ensued. It's a diary just of 8.5 months, from June 1834 to February 1835. But what we have now are 2 parallel accounts of a lesbian relationship in one household. And I think that's incredibly rare. I know of only one other set of diaries, and this goes back to Votes-Woman, the Blaithwaites, in 1911, 3 diaries written in one household. But this is in a lesbian relationship in one household. So I think it's very, very rare and possibly unique. And I'll leave you with this question. How do we compare these 2 diaries? Thank you.
Amazing. Oh, it's so lovely to listen to you, Jill. You could keep going for another hour very, very happily. There's so much good stuff in there. And to join in with Pat Eastgate, yeah, thank you so much for bringing Anne back to life almost, and investigating so much into her diaries, and changing many, many people's lives with the result of that. So amazing. And in regard of the community, Jill, at the moment, there's a big hype going on about season 2, and sort of the strength of the community seems to be building up more and more and more and more. How have you experienced the strength of the community, and how do you feel connected to that community that has sort of sprung up around all things Anne Lister?
Well, community is a funny word, isn't it? I think what most people mean by the community is women in the LGBT community. And that, of course, has exploded absolutely enormously. But if you live in and around Halifax, and our local area is called Calderdale, you probably have a slightly different interpretation as well, which is the local community. And there, the impact of Gentleman Jack has been absolutely enormous. I mean, what I tried to suggest when I first moved to Halifax in 1980, it was becoming a rather depleted town with deindustrialization, the textile industry having gone, and engineering going. And two things have helped revive the local community. One is the Peace Hall. And if you haven't been to Halifax, please do come and see our wonderful, wonderful late 18th century Venetian-inspired Peace Hall. And then, of course, Gentleman Jack and the Anne Lister diaries. So it's all just incredibly positive, and its impact on us has been wonderful, absolutely wonderful.
Mm-hmm. Lovely to hear. It's really nice to hear it's somebody actually encouraging tourism to their area. So that's really lovely to hear. Myself, I went on a pilgrimage to Halifax in 2020. So it was really, really touching to go and visit Shibden Hall and kind of walk the streets of Halifax, the places that she would have gone. So really, yeah, I can only second Jill there. Definitely go on that pilgrimage into the footsteps of Anne. Amazing. Jill, also, you wrote Female Fortune in sort of the late 1990s, 98. It was released. How was your experience now revisiting the work nearly 25 years later for your latest edition of the book? Are you still standing up to everything? Would you change anything?
I am, yes. I'm I'm an incredibly thorough researcher. You know, I sit happily in the archives for hours on end, days on end. When I was going through the Anne Walker Crow Nest papers in the 1990s, nobody had looked at them before, and I would have to go out to the toilet because my hands were just within hours, less than hours, minutes, just covered in dust because nobody had looked at the Walker papers. Nobody was interested in Anne Walker. And I thought, we just need to, Anne Lister was her own archivist, and she's incredibly methodical. But sadly, for all the sort of questions of legal complexity and lunacy and so on, after Anne Lister's death in 1840, the Anne Walker papers and Crow Nest papers are a complete nightmare for archivists, partly because some of them were pulled out to be used in litigation in legal cases. So to answer your question in a slightly indirect way, I haven't wanted to change anything. I did add one little sentence, about 10 words, at the end of the marriage ceremony, the little private marriage ceremony at Easter 1834, about the brevity of Anne Lister's comments, because I just thought this is a very sobering moment. But otherwise, I haven't changed anything. I've added things because we brought out a new edition in 2019 when there was quite a bit to say. And then for this new 2022 edition, I haven't had cause to add very much, other than, I'm really pleased about this, a new Afterword about the discovery of the Anne Walker diary and my thoughts on how the two compare.
Mm-hmm. Mhm. Yeah, that was really fascinating when that came out. And I think there are a couple of websites out there that actually compare the diary pages from Lister and from Walker. So it's been
Yeah,
really interesting to read how they have perceived the things they did during the day and everything else.
yeah, yeah.
Mm, absolutely. What I also loved about the latest edition was part of your acknowledgements. You thanked your partner that they were able to share a house with Anne Lister for the last 30 years.
Yes.
And I guess that sort of kind of ties in. What has Anne brought to your life, Jill, directly? What
Um,
did she bring to the party?
she brought an awful lot. Um, I I found that that's a difficult question to answer because you want an exciting answer, and I'm going to give a slightly humdrum answer. Um, I found that when I turned to became a feminist historian in the 70s, around 1974, that was a moment of incredible excitement that I was living in Oldham then in Lancashire at the edge of the Pennines, and next door to the mill that Annie Kenny worked in, and I could still interview one or two elderly women who could remember the Kenny family and could just about remember Annie Kenny, and that was just incredibly exciting. And that informed my research and my writing about the radical suffragists, etc., through the 70s and into the 80s. So by the time I came to Anne Lister, I was fairly mature and experienced. But, you know, she is just an absolutely riveting character. And I don't regret for a single minute that I've encountered Anne Lister, or that I've worn out so many pairs of glasses. I've got a whole shoebox full of this is a shoebox full of I became the optician's friend because I was forever going back to the optician. I think I might need my eyes testing again, because at that stage, which is of course pre-digitalization in the 1990s, we were working from printouts from the microfilm, and they were sort of pale grey or dark grey on pale grey, and I was peering at them, and my eyesight was getting weaker and weaker. But she was so compulsive and compelling that I had to carry on. So thank you, Anne Lister. I have no regret. I have no regrets. No regrets.
She made you visually impaired, but she certainly brought a lot to your life as well.
Absolutely.
And since you peered at her diaries in such detail, what is the most curious or unexpected thing that you found peering at them?
I don't think anything's unexpected, because once you understand Anne Lister and understand her sort of dynastic identity as a member of the ancient Lister family inheriting Shibden Hall, and her class confidence as a member of the landed gentry, you understand pretty much everything about Anne Lister. She was not going to compromise 1 second her sexuality. And I started off by saying there were men she had nice friendly relationships with, her lawyer, her Uncle James, Samuel Washington, the land agent, and so on and so forth. But she never entertained for a second the idea of a heterosexual marriage, even though it would have been a very convenient fig leaf. She just wasn't going to do it. She was completely uncompromising. And for me, Anne Lister is a sort of organic whole. And once we understand her social class, a member of the landed gentry inheriting Shibden Hall, and understand the strength of her sexual identity, and that she would not use the fig leaf of a heterosexual marriage, you pretty much get everything.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Holistic, organic, authentic, definitely all words to describe her. I think what is sometimes the downfall for us is to kind of view her with our 21st century eyes.
Exactly.
Of course she was a Tory. Of course she had children working in her coal mines. Just normal back then.
Yeah. It was only boys, as far as I know, and girls, as far as I know, partly because heaving those corves full of coal along the incline would be beyond the power of a girl. But yes, it would have been extraordinary if she hadn't been active at elections like the 1835 election, the 1837 election, and if she hadn't been active in the blue Tory, which would gradually be called Conservative Party interest. Of course she was, and of course so was Anne Walker.
That really reminds me of the Guardian review that I read just yesterday as a response to the season 2 first episode, and the author was saying that about breaking the fourth wall in the series, how she sometimes, or Suran Jones sometimes looks in the camera. When she looks into the lens, she's also collapsing time, addressing us, the future inhabitants of the 21st century, where she might be understood, valued, and seen. Do you think that would happen nowadays if she was to try and time travel and pop up in 21st century?
That's a very speculative question, and how can we answer that? What's your answer, Stef?
Oh gosh, yeah, I'd love to say so. Understood, valued, and seen. Certainly making us thinking about it, and sort of that whole concept of collapsing time as well, sort of us viewing historical figures with our knowledge nowadays. But yeah, certainly would be quite an interesting thought.
Yeah. Have we got questions from anybody else who's watching, listening?
Absolutely. I was just going to go on to those. Yeah, we've got quite a bit of chat going on, and Mari has been very kind in passing those on. First question came in from Helen Whitehead. Hello, Helen. Jill, out of all of your books on the suffragettes, Greenham, or on Anne Lister, which is your personal favorite and why?
Well, I haven't just written about the suffragettes, the women who were prepared to break the law and go to prison for the vote. I also wrote about the suffragists, and in particular about the radical suffragists, the working class women of Lancashire, who decided that it was the most effective way to win the vote and win over public opinion was without breaking the law. I think of all my books, the ones I feel most proud of and which have reached the widest audience is firstly the book about the radical suffragists called One Hand Tied Behind Us, which came out in 1978, Virago, and has been reissued in new editions subsequently, still in print. And then I think it has to be Female Fortune, because it was a massive work to do, but Anne Lister is so staggering, and as I say, regrets, I haven't even had a few.
Beautiful, beautiful. So Jill, what sort of legacy do you envisage Female Fortune to have?
What do you mean?
Sort of legacy, sort of looking back at it, and sort of what are you envisaging future generations to take away from it, sort of the things you've written about?
Well, I suppose, for many people, for most people, their entree into the Anne Lister world is via Gentleman Jack. And that is an absolutely staggeringly wonderful drama for BBC One and HBO. And Sally Wainwright is an absolute genius script writer. However, I think, for people who want to find out more about Anne Lister, and even somebody as wonderful as a writer as Sally Wainwright can only put so much into hour-long episodes, I would encourage them to go and read Female Fortune, because they'll see some of the nuances and I was able to put Anne Lister into context, because I think unless you understand her context of Halifax and the West Riding and how corrupt politics was, Anne Lister didn't have the vote herself because women were excluded from the vote under the 1832 Act. Neither she nor Anne Walker had the vote because they were women, but they had power over the men who could vote. That was their enfranchised tenants, and they doorstep them, and they give new meaning, ferocious meaning to the word doorstep. And if you look at how Anne Walker's tenants and Anne Lister's tenants voted in the 1835 and 37 elections, they virtually all voted as their landowner wanted them to, because they didn't have much choice. I think that's the factor.
And that's what I really love about your writing, Jill, because you don't just look at Anne Lister's diaries, but also at the context of the time that she was writing them in. So there's so much more information in there. Absolutely.
Another questions from other people?
I was just going to say another question from the chat. That's somebody called Sal. Jill, if you could walk or visit any place Anne went in her life, where would be top of your list? Where would you like to walk where Anne has walked?
Well,
down from Biennale.
Certainly Vigmore was top of my to-do list, top of my to-go list, and it is absolutely magnificent, even though it's a horrendously vertical climb at the very, very end. And we had to stay in a little cabin, as did Anne Lister, though not, I'm sure, the same cabin, overnight. And we were all in sleeping bags. And all I remember is about 4 o'clock in the morning, and it was pretty dark. And there was about 20 of us sleeping on the floor in these sleeping bags. There was suddenly a slithering of young male Spanish bodies slithering out of their sleeping bags and slithering out of the door and slithering up, I've absolutely no doubt, up to Vigmore, and then just in time to get down back to their home in Spain. So that would be a go-to destination I'd really recommend. I'm now so excited about reading Captain Cochrane and his pedestrian journey through Russia. Whether I'm ever going to get to Russia at the moment, maybe not, and to Siberia. It's a very exciting read. I didn't think it was going to be, but he writes in a very jaunty way. And what I've done more locally, if we leave Vigmore on one side and Russia and Siberia on another side, is I belong to a walking organisation called Calderdale Heritage Walks. And we organise walks around Shibden and Halifax, and I have a few coming up this summer. So I'm hoping that anybody who's actually in Halifax can join. You can get them on Calderdale Heritage Walks on the website. Come and join our walk. You'll enjoy it. Walk in Anne Lister's footsteps. See what she saw. See her landscape. I think once you walk in Anne Lister's footsteps in her landscape, you just understand her so much more clearly and more vividly.
And how fit she really must have been.
And how fit, super fit.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely. Oh, thanks for that, Jill. Another question from Nadine Andrews. Jill, you said that according to the diaries, Anne Lister dressed very feminine, so not quite like Gentleman Jack. Can you say any more on artistic license and anything else in a TV drama that's not entirely historically accurate?
Probably no. Probably no. What I said was that Anne, at least I hope this is what I said, that Anne Lister wasn't very terribly interesting clothes. She doesn't spend a long time on the average day thinking, shall I put this on? Shall I put that on? And the one time when she describes her clothes in intricate detail, layer after layer after layer, is when she's climbing up Vigmore with her two local guides from the foothills of the French Pyrenees. And there she describes every single layer she's wearing, which is all of them are very, very feminine and seems to involve an awful lot of muslin and chemises, etc., etc. So that's, I mean, I tend to sort of try and want to stick to the evidence. And if anybody can find other sections of the diary where Anne Lister describes her clothes in considerable detail, please do let me know. And often they're sort of rather throwaway remarks because it's not a subject she's really interested in, compared to, say, pre-Darwinian geology or politics or engineering or
Absolutely. Absolutely. Apart from German, which always made her fall asleep, apparently.
Yeah.
I love that much. Fantastic. Another question, Jill, coming in from Zifra. You've read so much of Anne's diaries, so they are curious to know what your favorite years were in the diaries. What were your favorite Anne years of the diaries that you've read or transcribed?
I mean, they're all absolutely mesmerizing. So it's very hard to pick a year or a period that is more mesmerizing and more magnetic than others. I find the elections very, very gripping because I'm a very sort of political person. So how she's doorstepping her enfranchised male tenants and how the wives who are controlling the doorstep say, I think my husband's out this year. Or one of them, I think my husband's gone away to Scotland on business. But I suppose the 1834 year is particularly interesting in female fortune because so much happens as Anne Lister wants it to happen. And that's coming across in the end of series 1 and the beginning of series 2, that the betrothal scenes, the exchange of rings up in North Yorkshire, and then the ceremony, if we can call it that, of taking the sacrament together at Goodham Gate Church at Easter 1834, and then they travel in the summer, and then Anne Walker comes to live in Shibden with Anne Lister, with her sister, and with her elderly father and elderly aunt. So there's a lot happens in that year. And then, so that's early September that Anne Walker moves in. And then in January, so it's only about 3 months later, the 1835 election. And I'm not going to spoil it by telling you what happens. I'm not going to mention the mock marriage announcement. I'm not going to say how much the Whigs, the Yellows, were spitting pips. I think you're going to see that possibly next Sunday or Sunday soon. But I think exactly.
Hello.
It's extremely exciting. And I mean, what is amazing about Anne Lister, amongst the things that are amazing about Anne Lister, is it's like having a video recorder trained on each room in Shibden or each pathway around her estate, around Shibden, or down into Halifax. And she's got this phenomenal observation powers and then somehow phenomenal memory. So she's hearing this conversation with a rather stroppy tenant, say, and then hours later she goes back and writes it up. And you're thinking, yes, that's what he did say. Yes, and you replied. And then, gosh, I mean, just absolutely extraordinary. Absolutely extraordinary.
Absolutely. Oh, fantastic. Yeah, we can't wait. So what are you looking forward to seeing the most in season 2? Is there something that you're really looking forward to without saying any spoilers?
I think I'm looking forward to the entire series. And I think Sally is just, I mean, all I've seen is episode 1, like everybody else, or virtually everybody else. And I think she's just in her, got into her stride now. She's absolutely got Anne Lister, absolutely. And one of the comments that people have made, like the reviewers who were reviewing last Sunday's episode, they say, gosh, she walked so fast. I was just exhausted just watching her talk about how fast she goes. And I think Sally, because she is a brilliant, brilliant genius scriptwriter, has conveyed the pace and ambition of Anne Lister's daily life so brilliantly.
Absolutely, yeah. Oh, I barely took a breath in that 1 hour.
Exactly.
It was just so
wow,
captivating, and just
yeah.
keep running to keep up. Absolutely. Jill, another question here from Ken. Do you have any feminist historians you would recommend looking back at chapters of British history? Feminist historians that you would recommend?
I'd ask you what are you interested in? Ken, what are you most interested in? I don't think we can talk to Ken.
Yeah, I don't think we can directly.
So you
but Mari is looping back to Ken just now, but there might be a wee lag. But sort of generally speaking, or even about you personally, which sort of historians you might have enjoyed in the past?
Well, I suppose of the feminist historians, the feminist historian who had the most impact on me was Sheila Rowbottom. And that was particularly her book, Hidden from History, which, just to summon up exactly the right date, but early 1970s off the top of my head. And she just managed to, in quite a smallish book, it wasn't a massive tome, to cover so much of both intellectual history for feminism and for feminist women, but also the texture of lived life and everyday life. And I'm absolutely certain it's still in print, and she's a wonderful writer. And she's included people like Alexandra Kollontai, who was Russian, or German writers, or American writers like Emma Goldman. So it's very, very broad, and it's an enticing read if you haven't come across it as yet.
Fantastic. Brilliant. I think we've just heard back from Ken as well, saying that anything that touches on working class history, which doesn't seem to get much space.
Well, the classic book on working class history, written just 6 miles from where I'm sitting, written ironically just about half a mile from Shibden, 3/4 mile from Shibden, is E.P. Thompson's The Making of the English Working Class, which came out in hardback in 1964, and then in paperback a little bit later. In fact,
something I prepared earlier.
You can see how incredibly battered it is. Can you see how incredibly battered it is?
Oh, yes.
Lots of little bits of paper. And this is my second copy, because I spilt glue all over the first copy. But I think you'll just really enjoy this, Ken, because The Making of the English Working Class, and it just starts off with the most memorable, that the number of our members be unlimited. This is the first of the leading rules of the London Corresponding Society, March 1792. And this book, first published in 1963, and then in Penguin in 1968, and still going strong.
Amazing. Fantastic.
Yeah, well worth it. And because Edward Thompson was writing it quite near here, there's a lot of the local landscape that Anne Lister would have known. I mean, no political sympathies between Edward Thompson and Anne Lister, but a lot of rich landscape detail.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. And of course, if you want to order the book, you can do that through Lighthouse Books. Just saying.
Yeah, of course you
can. Jill, I think we're coming to the end of last question coming in from Erin. Erin's question you might be able to see in the chat as well. There's been a lot of academic and journalistic writing around Anne Lister as a symbol of both lesbian and transgender non-conforming history. Obviously, this is all anachronistic, but I'm interested to know what you think about the idea of Anne functioning as a historical figure beyond lesbian history.
I'm not quite sure what that question means. Beyond lesbian history. I'm not quite sure what that means.
And you're not the only one. So I did actually ask again. So I was like, I'm not quite sure if I'm getting this.
Yes. Yeah.
And the interpretation was that Anne might be seen as a lesbian icon or a gender non-conforming icon rather than just a historical figure. And I guess the question
she was, I mean, because she was so amazing, she was all those things. She's always going to be a lesbian icon, I think, partly because of everything she accomplished, and I tried to give a flavour of that, and also because of her amazing diary. But I think it's perfectly possible to read her diaries just to get And I apologise for coming back to elections again. But if you want to know how, we might today, risk of getting political, think that our politics are a bit corrupt. Well, you want to see the 1830s, because there was no secret ballot then. Women had been excluded from the vote under the terms of the 1832 Reform Act, and it would be another generation before the secret ballot was introduced. So everybody knew how everybody else voted. And Anne Lister's diaries and her letters are an absolute illuminating about how corrupt, I think it's not too strong a word, corrupt, we would see corrupt politics were. She didn't see it as corrupt. What she saw was the people who represent and speak for the landed interest, i.e. who own the land, who represent the land in England, must, of course, have power to do what they want. And people say, well, would Anne Lister have been a suffragette? Well, hardly. She had a conversation, sort of whispered conversation, with one of the older women, I think it was Mrs. Norcliffe, out the other side of York, about some women, landowning women, women of the right sort of level of education, being given the right, restored to the ancient right of voting. And it was a sort of whispered conversation because they knew they were out of kilter with the times. But that was where Anne Lister was. If you had the right education and you had the landed interest at your heart, you should surely be able to have the vote. Surely.
Mm-hmm. Nice one. Oh, fantastic. Thank you, Erin, for this amazing question. Really glad to finish on a high because we've come to the end of our hour together. And I'm just checking in with you, Jill. Any closing comments? Anything you want to pass on to anyone who's listening?
No, I'm just so pleased to have have met you, Steph, and to have come into contact with the Lighthouse Bookshop. And I'm so sorry that it's just on Zoom, but then Zoom has its advantages, hasn't it? And I'm hoping to come up to Edinburgh and the Lighthouse Bookshop to actually see the Lighthouse Bookshop before too long, because when I lived in Edinburgh, 1968-71, it was pre-Lighthouse, wasn't it? Mm-hmm. I mean, there were some wonderful bookshops in Edinburgh, but not Lighthouse. So I just have to come before too long, and I'm going to walk up to the castle, and I'm going to walk up slowly up to Arthur's Seat and enjoy, and see what Anne Lister saw.
Maybe not in 10 minutes. Take your time.
10 hours.
Wonderful. Oh. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
I'm just jumping on at the end to say a big thank you on behalf of the Lighthouse. Thank you, Jill, for your brilliant book and for always bringing your scholarship to date and being so passionate about bringing it to more people. And you won't have seen for the chat, but there were people watching from Bo'ness to Berlin. And it's just really exciting that, although we can't be in the bookshop together, that this space does allow us to have these conversations beyond the four walls of the shop. So thank you for that. And thank you, Steph, for being such a brilliant facilitator. Your love of Anne Lister and your passion for Jill's work really made all of this come alive and made it feel like we were in the room. So thank you. And before we sign off, if you could flag for the Edinburgh viewers, or for anyone who is planning a trip to Edinburgh, anything about the Anne Lister tours that they can look out for.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been really nice to start up doing events again in person, but I appreciate on Zoom calls you can kind of have a much bigger crowd from further afield as well. So if anyone wants to come to Edinburgh, but likewise for any locals want to find out more about Anne Lister's history in our very capital, they are free Anne Lister walking tours with the kind support of Heritage Lottery Fund between now and the end of June. For any dates and details, check out the website annelistertours.co.uk. And next thing I'm going to do is to sign up to one of Jill's walking tours and call it. So we're looking forward to visiting.
If anybody else is planning to come to Halifax, Calderdale, do have a look at Calderdale Heritage Walk's website, because they'll give you the dates and some of the routes we take around Shibden and Halifax, and you can walk in Anne Lister's footsteps. It's wonderful.
Yeah, I love it. And what a brilliant note to end on.